Hello and welcome to Insurrection with Brenton Lengel, the former radio show, now I guess podcast or YouTube channel. Hi, my name is Brenton Lengel. I am a poet, a comic book creator, and a former activist with Occupy Wall Street. I am an anarchist. And today I am interviewing Ben Burgis. Ben is a leftist professor, the author of Give Them an Argument. And Ben, do you want to kind of go into yourself? I'm sure you're very famous, so I'm sure everybody knows you, but just in case some newbie clicks on the video.
Yeah, I don't know. Probably depends on the borders of everybody there, but yeah, let's see. So yeah, I'm a philosophy instructor, Georgia State University, Perimeter College. A Jacobin columnist, and I am a co-host of a podcast called the Dead Pundit Society, and I also have a solo show also called Give Them an Argument.
That's excellent. And now, Give Them an Argument, you've been on my radar for a while, so I was really excited to come and speak with you. But this kind of really ties into your book because, you know, a lot of people have put out, a lot of people have put out advice to the left, some in good faith, others in very bad faith. And I found that you're one of the few people who not only wrote a book on rhetoric, and has the academic qualifications, but also you go out and you put your money where your mouth is, and you've had a number of debates. You've debated Stefan Molyneux, and recently you debated Mr. Reagan on modern day debate. That was just a day or two ago, correct?
Yeah, yep, that's right. So the modern day debate with Mr. Reagan was about whether racism was still a significant social problem in the United States.
I don't see how anyone can think that it wouldn't be, but
you'd think so. Although I certainly got the sense every time I scanned to look at the chat that there were some people there who are definitely sympathetic to his position.
Yeah, I mean, well, the chat on modern day debate is always a shit show. And what was interesting, though, that I found was usually the comments in the chat swing far right. And because it started out as a religious debate channel, and then they also have a lot of flat earthers in their thing. But the comments on the actual video, at least last time I checked, just about all of them were saying that you cleaned Mr. Reagan's clock, which I would agree. And I watched the debate beginning to end and the Q&A session afterwards.
Yeah, so I mean, it was an interesting thing because I guess my impression of it was that he was maybe expecting that I or whoever they found to argue with him was going to just get really upset about what he was saying and call him a racist and burst into tears or something. And then so I think just kind of taking seriously what he was saying and being like, oh, okay, but how does this add up, right? How do you account for this? If racism isn't a big deal, then why does this happen? Why does that happen? Right. How do you account for the results of this study where if you have a black sounding name attached to the same job application, you're 36% less likely to get a call back than a racially neutral or white sounding name. And I don't know. I mean, I guess it didn't really seem like he knew quite what to do with that. I think see some of the showmanship. Certainly, I mean, he's got a 250,000 subs on YouTube, right? So he's clearly doing something that's effective, with his audience. He
has a good voice, and he you can tell he speaks confidently. And the far right, it was interesting for me because I was doing when I first did my radio show Insurrection with Brenton Lengel. I did it for a year, and we did a lot of stuff working out of the Occupy movement. And And I gave up the radio show because it was taking up too much time, and I was getting too depressed by having to read the news every week and finding like a new reason to be pissed off about something. So I don't know how certain media personalities do it without losing their minds, or maybe they do. But the thing is that sort of right-wing radio is a big thing. Radio is as big on the right as like I would say comedy is on the left.
Right.
And so like people who are right wingers can go very, very far doing public access, doing YouTube for a long time, really skewed far right. So I think he kind of sits comfortably in a niche. Mm-hmm. Like he's almost like a more cleaned up, less batshit Alex Jones was what I noticed. There was almost a similarity, but it seems like him and Alex Jones are very similar guys. Alex is just way off the deep end, and he seems to more keep his foot in respectable conservatism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could see that. That like just certainly in terms of persona, there's something there. Like not like the version of Alex Jones who's like ripping his shirt off and screaming about gay frogs, but like the version. The version of Alex Jones who like you see sometimes in like older videos where he's like kind of like hanging out and like talking to somebody who's like maybe even like kind of some hippie in Austin who, and they're like trying to find some common ground. And, so he's not like going into the Illuminati stuff, but he's, but he's kind of pitching the anti-authoritarian version of his thing. Like, and certainly just some of the like personal vibe, right, is a little bit like what you get for like Alex Jones and his more low-key moments.
Yeah, I could kind of smell Mr. Reagan's aftershave like through the screen. If anybody hasn't seen the debate, that's the kind of guy we're talking about. So
yeah. I mean whatever. It's not entirely like the late Michael Brooks used to say, and he was kind of joking, but he kind of wasn't, right? That Alex Jones was the most talented broadcaster of our generation, and you can't see what he means by that.
Yeah, he definitely is, and my condolences on that, by the way. I didn't know him, but everything I've heard, it was just incredible about him, just as a person.
Yeah.
Anyway, didn't mean to bring things down right there, but
yeah.
But so my question here is, as we went into the debate, one of the things, and I think that this is something that has gone unsaid by a lot of people on the right, that Mr. Reagan kind of touched upon, because as I was watching this, it seemed like he thinks, because he kept saying that the reason he kept giving for the financial disparity between blacks and whites. The thing that he kept giving was he kept trying to insist that it was anti-white racism, that the black community were telling its children that white people are terrible and therefore you shouldn't go to school, and therefore and I feel like there is that perception, like if you have no class consciousness, if you have no conception of how interactions with police and authorities are different when you look different. You may come to a time where like people, where you're like, well, I can do it, so why can't they? And the thing that just amazed me was like, dude, do you think black people haven't thought of that? Do you think they haven't thought of, well, what if I put on a suit and try to speak nicely?
Well, right. Yeah, I mean, that's so absurd too, right? Because like, I mean, whatever. I mean, your mileage may be different, right? But like where I teach in Georgia, right? I have lots of black students. Like these subjects will come up, right? And what I tend to hear from people is like, oh yeah, there's like, there's a way that I talk when I'm among my friends, right? And there's a way that I talk at work because I know I'll be like treated better at work. I'll get better, more ahead if I do that, right? I mean, this was if you've ever seen the Boots Riley movie, Sorry to Bother You. This was a joke in the movie. There was the white voice, that you had to use on the phone, where they had like Patton Oswalt and other white comedians playing the black characters' white voices. So I mean, whatever. And I'm not saying that's like a universal experience or anything like that, but I do think that like I don't think you have to get out of the world that much to run into people who will report things like that, right? Like seems pretty straightforward. But
I mean, I used to manage like nonprofit arts telefundraising and telemarketing, and the thing is that the non-racial like the white voice, I laughed my ass off at that because like the ascended version of the white voice, by the way, is the British voice. Because anytime like somebody came and like applied for the job with me and I heard a British accent, I was calling that person because people just throw money at them.
Yeah, totally. And, but I mean, like you can see as zany as this view that like, like black people are just en masse refusing to go to school or wear suits, because it's too white. Like as zany as that is, and as kind of disconnected from, I think most people's experience of reality as that is, you can see how conservatives get there, right? Because like at a certain point, you only have so many explanatory options, right? Because like, all right, we've got the data point that's just staring you in the face, which is that black people in the United States, statistically, right, are much more likely to live in poverty than white people in the United States. And then you have to explain that somehow.
Yep.
Now, if you go with the obvious explanation that this has something to do with the fact that we've had one version or another of like explicit legal racial apartheid in the United States up until 1964, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's when we legally committed to stopping that. Obviously, there's some I think it's safe to say that compliance was not universal, in like 1965. Yeah. But like even if it had been, right? Like we've had some version of slavery, Jim Crow, right? Some kind of legal system according to which the legal rights and obligations of white people and black people were very different throughout almost all of American history. And, the Federal Housing Administration, up until very recently, like a blink of an eye historically, like mm-hmm. their official policy, right? Redlining was that the rating for property values would explicitly depend on whether there were black people living in a neighborhood. And it's like there's a very straight line there, right? It's a little bit like back when, Copernicus, was arguing with people who believed in the geocentric, right, theory of astronomy.
Model of the universe, yeah.
Yeah. And so you have the heliocentric model where the sun is the center and the geocentric model where the earth is the center. And given the kind of astronomical observations you could make with technology that existed at the time, you could come up with a star map that fit either one. But you got to a point where, the geocentric ones kind of went like, this, because, it was like really hard to fit all your observations within that model. It's kind of the same thing. So there's this really straight line. It's this really easy, obvious explanation. It's like, yeah, that makes sense, right? If like up until like when my parents were like going into their teens, right? Like there was like legally explicit racial apartheid in the United States, then you could see how it would come to be that you would have these long-term intergenerational patterns of different wealth distribution, right? That's pretty obvious. But if you admitted that, then it's really hard to be a conservative, like if you acknowledge that, because if you admit that, then that seems incredible. Like that makes the distribution of wealth in the United States seem incredibly unjust because mm-hmm. like if you're just admitting that like, oh, just arbitrarily some people, because their ancestors were slaves or lived under Jim Crow, right, have different life opportunities and outcomes than other people who got genetically luckier. That's really hard to justify for most people. And so unless you're just like an outright white supremacist, if you want to be a conservative, if you want to justify the current distribution of wealth in the United States, you kind of have to reject that explanation. But then you've only got a couple options, right? Because once you've rejected that, either you go with some sort of biological explanation, right? You go all Charles Murray.
Yeah, which makes you a fascist, essentially.
Yeah. And most conservatives, obviously, like, don't want to go there. They prefer not to see themselves in that light. Mm-hmm. if you're not going to admit that it's the historical explanation is right, and you're going to reject the crazy town race science explanation, then all you're left with is some sort of cultural explanation. Like, cause what else are you going to do? Right. I mean, like, those are the three options, right? Either it's, either it's the effect of the history, or it's something biological, or it's something cultural, or else I guess number 4 is maybe like, is just this amazing coincidence.
They just happened to work out.
Yeah,
way.
Everybody's individual choices and interactions in the market just happen to work out so that it lines up exactly with the intergenerational patterns going back to we're talking like a generation, right? Back to Jim Crow. So of course they're going to come up with this kind of cultural explanations, but then like actually like explaining that, right? If you want to say not just like, the explanation is cultural, but you want to say no, like what exactly do you mean by that, right?
Yeah.
Then you're going to come up with something that's kind of wacky on the level of, black people are refusing en masse to wear suits to job interviews because that would be too white.
Yeah, which, oh my God. This is coming from a guy who hates to wear a suit. Even I will wear a suit to an interview. And I have trauma from freaking boarding school behind not wearing a suit. So I don't know what's going on with their version of black people. Now, this is interesting too, because like when I was a kid, I was conservative. Like I was raised in a, like not a super conservative house, but my dad's a Republican. I remember like when I gradually became aware of racism, the first thing I was just like, well, that's horrible. And I was horrified. Then later on, as I grew up, I started to internalize more right-wing media, just sort of via osmosis and cultural stuff. And also, being raised fairly well-to-do. My dad's a doctor. Like I just sort of universalized my experience to everyone else. And I'm like, well, it doesn't seem that hard to get ahead in society. I didn't have that conception. And I remember I watched the movie American History X. And
I watched that.
And there was that line, and at the time, like teenage me, like saw that line where Edward Norton is like, well, how long has it been since slavery? How long does it take to get on your feet? Like, and I think a lot of conservatives, like if you don't think about it and you don't have that background, like that line makes sense. And you're like, yeah, how long does it take to get on your feet? Right. But of course, I thought that what was really interesting was that the case of Freddie Gray. Now you remember what happened with Freddie Gray in Baltimore. What a lot of people were not aware of was that Freddie Gray grew up in illegal tenement housing as a direct result of redlining.
Right.
And grew up, and in this illegal tenement housing, they still had lead paint on the walls. And so as a child, he was poisoned by the lead paint on the walls, which literally damaged his brain. And he and his sisters won a lawsuit about this. And their money was then stolen from them by corporations, tricking them into selling away the vast majority of it for a lump sum when they were literally had difficulty even comprehending the stuff. And all of these factors led up to what happened between Freddie Gray and those officers when they decided to give him a rough ride that ultimately took his life. Like that is a very direct example of where you've got going, like it's incredibly tragic, but it's a great example of how the legacy of Jim Crow and redlining affects people today. Because I think Freddie Gray was younger than you and me. He wasn't that old.
I believe so. Yeah. No, that's right. And I think the kind of key point, right, thinking about that American History X line, it's not so much like if you kind of bring it down to the level of remembering that we're talking about a bunch of individual human beings, right? Like not some like collective racial unit, right? Then I think that the main thing to keep in mind is that actually like escaping from poverty is really difficult just for anybody, right? Like it doesn't matter, right? Like really regardless of the particular set of historical circumstances that led your family to be in that situation, it's just very difficult to get out of that situation. Which is not to say that some people don't, of course, but it's a little bit like saying that if you have a race where, you know, some people are starting from one starting point and some people are starting from a mile back, then you know, the first few people to like cross the finish line are probably not going to include very many of the people who started a mile back, right? Like maybe
exactly.
You know, maybe
even if you've got like, maybe Usain Bolt or something is running and
right. Like he would make it, right? But like most people wouldn't, because most people don't have, you know, like most people just like you have to be incredibly good at it, right? To do it. And some people are, right? Like, and it's not a matter of saying like, because I think sometimes people hear this and they think you're saying that, oh, like, you know, circumstances are destiny and nobody could ever arise by it. It's like, no, you could arise past it. It's just harder, right? Like that's, you know, like, and so fewer people will do it, right? All kinds of things might happen in the life of any individual, but statistically, if you have like, you know, 200 people running a marathon and 100 of them started from a mile back from the other 100, then like the 10 people who crossed the finish line first, probably not more than a couple of them, you know, will be from the group that started a mile back, because that's just harder. And something, in fact, I thought one of the most interesting things in the debate were the points where Mr. Reagan kind of granted that, in fact, I think he even sort of brought up at one point, because you know, I don't think he was kind of seeing how it all related to what the main thing we were talking about, that poverty tends to perpetuate itself intergenerationally for everybody, right? Who's in poverty, right? If you're, you know, because again, like you're starting from a mile back, so like you're more likely to have a job after school, so you have less time to study, or you're more likely to have to take care of your, you know, siblings, you know, because they're, you know, your parents are less likely to be able to send them to daycare, whatever it is, right? Like there are 1,000 ways in which you're less likely to reach the middle class, you know, if you start out in bad circumstances, and so, of course, right, that applies to poor white people as well as to poor black people. It's just that there are more, like a higher proportion of black people start out poor because of Jim Crow and redlining and the rest of those things. In fact, my favorite moment in the debate was the one where I brought up that job applicant study that I mentioned earlier, you know, about the callbacks.
I love that you didn't let him forget about that. He kept wanting to.
Yeah, because he even said things like later in the debate, like, oh, job discrimination is like very rare. It's like, that's not rare. You're 36% less likely to get a callback. Right? Like that's pretty common. But then like he had to come up with like a non-racial explanation of that. And his non-racial explanation was basically, if you have a name that sounds obviously black, people will think that you grew up poor. Because remember, it's not that you're poor at that moment, because you're looking at a resume. It literally tells you
the person went to Harvard or whatever.
Yeah, exactly, right. You know, but like they at least came out of poverty, so like classism would lead them to be less likely to call back. It's like, okay, but if the thing that's causing the classism to come into play is the racial identification, that like that sort of seems like a distinction without difference, right? Like in other words, if people will think you grew up poor because they think you're black, and therefore they're going to discriminate against you, right? Like that seems like just discriminating against you because they think you're black with one more step.
Absolutely. And, you know, that was really interesting, too, because he seems like he wanted a study. He wanted a study that had like basically redneck names on it and see how often the rednecks get a call back, as opposed to. And what amazed me on that is, granted, like class in America is a lot of times like tied to it is tied to more things than race. It is tied to culture and stuff. And there are people that make, you know, I think the example is, you know, you go in for brain surgery and just before the doctor puts you under, you know, suddenly you hear he's got a thick Appalachian accent. Some people are going to get, I can say that because I'm from Kentucky, but you know, some people are going to get worried about that. But that would be measuring something else completely different. Sorry.
Yeah, right. I mean, like that's just to say that like there's like cultural prejudice against people, who are like from like white people from Appalachia, which certainly exists, right? I mean, really, there's I think cultural prejudice against Southerners in general exists, right? I mean, that's why people, people, including my wife, right, who I went to grad school with, who come from the South, right, tended to have learned to disguise their accent, right? I mean, that's a white regional version of the "sorry to bother you" thing. Since we moved to Georgia, she'll let out the y'alls, in ways that she didn't, when we were up north. But that's a thing that exists. But the part of that confused me is like, okay, so yes, there are other cultural prejudices besides racial prejudice, but how does that undermine the existence of racial prejudice? That just seems like a non sequitur, right? Like I actually think my one real regret, because there was, like, as always with these things, right? Like there's always like a little bit of a dilemma because, like, okay, not to pick too much on Mr. Reagan, but like let's do like Stefan Molyneux, right? If you're arguing with Stefan Molyneux, he's gonna say like 5 things per second that are crazy, and you have to like
you have to focus in.
Yeah, you have to focus, right? So you're developing a line of argument, and like you can't address like every weird thing that comes out of his mouth. And without saying that Mr. R was as bad as Stefan Molyneux, I will say that like one of the things that he brought up once or a couple times maybe, right, that like I really wish that I had a chance to address, but like at the end of the day, there's only so much time and you just don't get to everything, especially as you're trying to pursue one point, was this thing about black cops, showing the same biases against black civilians as white cops, which he was taking as reason to think that
racism didn't exist.
Racism wasn't a factor in police, interactions with community, which just seems nuts to me. Because first of all, like this observation that black police officers tend to share the attitudes towards communities they're policing and their white colleagues has not like historically been lost on people who think that police racism is a big problem, right? Like go back to NWA's "Fuck the Police" and their lyrics about this and there, right? Like this is a well understood thing, right? And also, like, okay, this is something you would expect anywhere, right? Like if there are like I would expect that if you were looking at like, I don't know, like the British colonial police force in India, and that, if like maybe they had like a like Indian volume, like some Indian component of it under the British authorities, that worked with the people who came over from Britain, then like the people who are Indians who join that, who are like identifying with the other team, who are joining this force that's widely resented by other Indians, etc., right? Like, how do you think they're going to act? What attitudes do you think they're going to form towards the people they police? Because they'll be resented for their association with this. They'll have, again, like you want to believe that you're a good guy and you're doing something good, so you strongly identify with the people that you're working with. You if you have a lot of hostile interactions with the community, like it just seems very non-mysterious how this would happen. That like if racial bias in general was a problem in police departments, that people who were members of the communities that they were biased against join the police department, right? They would come to share the attitudes of the people that they're working with. Like honestly, I think if like you just told like an alien about race in America, and then like after like the first 20 minutes of described it to them, you said, okay, so if you had to guess, right, like would white cops show some of the same pattern of biases, black cops show some of the same pattern of biases, white cops, they'd say, oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's almost like he's been indoctrinated with liberal identity politics, to where like he actually thinks that if you're a member of a marginalized community, you cannot Like
Yeah, yeah,
you cannot be racist, because liberals will do that from the other direction.
right.
And this was one of the things, because a lot of the time I feel like a lot of these conservatives have never been confronted with an actual like leftist critique of power. They've really only had the sort of straw version of it in their head, and then they've had like shit they've heard from Democrats.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
have you found that, because you've got a background in Marxist philosophy? Um,
Yeah.
have you found like they just are surprised when you start talking to
Yeah.
them?
Yeah. No, I think that's a very common experience talking to conservatives, that they kind of expect everybody to just be like a liberal, or like at most just like some more extreme version of what liberals think.
Yeah.
And they're often very surprised when that's not the case. And yeah, I think that definitely came out in this one, right? Because like a lot, I feel like a sort of big picture issue in the debate, right? It's like the first thing, like the very first thing I said at the beginning is like, okay, look, racism is like a slightly ambiguous term. It can mean a couple of different things. I think they're related, they feed into each other, but they do mean different things. And like analytically, we should keep these a little bit separate, right? To like try to like talk about all of them. And so some of that's, just racial prejudice, right? But a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of what people mean when they talk about structural racism is like historically based racial disparities, right? And then, which mainly, like the main way that manifests is just the unequal distribution of poverty, right? That Black people are more likely than white people to live in poverty in the United States because of Jim Crow and redlining and all of those other things. And so I feel like there were several points over the course of the debate when Mr. Reagan was kind of saying, okay, but like, what about poor white people? And I think because he was expecting a certain version of liberal identity politics, right? So he was expecting me to say, oh no, that's not the same at all. And then I think he didn't quite know what to do with it when I said, yeah, right. Like,
it sucks to be in poverty.
Right. It sucks to be in poverty, regardless of what the historical explanation is of why you in particular are living in those circumstances. And yeah, a lot of that is going to be the same. Right. Like totally. Right. Like that's not a, like you can think, not only is there like, there's no tension whatsoever between saying it is clearly a historical fact that Black people are more likely to live in poverty than white people because America had legal apartheid up until the 1960s.
Yeah.
And like, a lot of what you can then say about the resultant experience is going to be the same for anybody who's living in poverty.
Well, I think when I had my debate with Armin over at Atheist Republic on like ours was on race. And one of the things he was really surprised about was that I said that 99% of white people have experienced oppression in their lives, not oppression based on race, but oppression based on class.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like because they're really used to people seeing things through this, liberal identity politics prism of like, racial essentialism. So like everybody, if you're, if you're white, you experience like if you're white, then you're you're the oppressor, right? You have it easy, right? I remember that thing, I don't know, like this was a long time ago, this is like 8 or 10 years ago, but it was going around. There was this like sort of there was this like liberal kind of meme thing going around about how if you're a straight white male, that's like playing the video game on the easiest settings, like that so which is really, by the way, like footnote to what we're talking about, but like is god awful political messaging, because if the implicit message that you're sending to most people is, oh, like you have all this privilege, you're living on easy street, so like if your life isn't going well, it must be your fault.
It definitely
that's not that's not going to make people sympathetic to what you're trying to sell, right? Like if what you say is, yeah, like if you're a poor working class person, then you're being screwed by the system. You should work together with everybody else who's in the same situation to change the system. And of course, those changes will disproportionately benefit Black and brown people because those are the people who've been most screwed over by the system. But that doesn't mean like that, that doesn't mean that most people within every identity category aren't on the bottom end of it, right? I mean, like just structurally, if you have capitalism, most people are not going to be beneficiaries of that, right? It's like like any like pyramid of cheerleaders, most of them are going to be on the bottom, right? That's the only way the weight works, like so. And it's kind of the same thing here, right? That like most people aren't going to benefit from it, but like what they're used to, what they want to argue with, because that's what they're reacting to, that's what they assume the opposition is people saying, like if you're white, you have it easy, like you have nothing to complain about, you're just whining if you are, and you should like, I don't know, like you should feel guilty and have a problem with racism as a matter of like guilt and altruism, and so if you come at them with no, most people are to one extent or another being screwed over by the current arrangement, and getting rid of a system that's disproportionately impacted Black and brown people is actually in the interest of most white people, right? Most white people are not, wealthy business owners, so most white people would benefit from this, right? Like a higher percentage of Black people would benefit more, right? But that doesn't mean that this isn't in the interests of the majority of the white population.
No, I totally get you. And interestingly enough, I don't know the numbers on this, but it would stand to reason that in terms of raw numbers, it might actually benefit more white people than Black people. Because I don't know if, as far as, white people are what, 60? It would
benefit a higher percentage of Black people
of Black people.
But yeah, it's probably still true that it would benefit more white people overall, right? Just because there's so many more of them. I think that's probably true, right? Like that, which actually, like even police killings, the majority of people who were killed by police are white, which is sometimes something that'll be brought up by, your Republican aunt or whoever, right? That like will sort of bring that up. So, see, you're saying this is a race thing, but majority are white. And then like the correct thing that a lot of liberals will say is, but it's but Black people are really disproportionately likely to be killed by the police, right? That like the percentage of Black victims of police killings is way higher than the percentage of Black people in the general population. So far, so good. But then the extra step that the liberals don't take is saying, and this shows that it is a broader problem, right? It's a problem that disproportionately falls on Black people, but it's also like really like militarized aggressive policing is a poor people problem. Like it's compounded by racial prejudice by police officers, certainly, right? That's an exacerbating factor, but by and large, the issue here is that, especially over the course of the last several decades, like speeding up during the presidency of Mr. Reagan's namesake, then like the United States kind of took a turn away from expanding the welfare state that was kind of getting going with the New Deal and the Great Society, and in the direction of saying, hey, what would be like way cheaper and like play way better, in the suburbs is if instead of actually doing like expanding this in ways that involve serious economic redistribution, let me just sent a whole bunch of cops in there and like arrested a whole lot of them, and like kind of like we didn't do anything about the poverty like fueling the crime, we just kind of kept it managed that way.
Yeah. And then, of course, they take those people that have been sentenced and they put them to work, essentially in virtual or I suppose literal slavery, because technically, if you are in prison, I think your status is a slave of the state. But like they'll put
Yeah,
people to work for
certainly.
pennies a
Yeah,
day.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, actually, if you read the text of the 13th Amendment, what it says is that slavery and forced labor will be outlawed except as a form of critical criminal
Yeah.
punishment. So yeah, I mean, it is pretty literally. I mean, whatever. Like you're working and you're not allowed to leave, right? Whatever you want to call it. I'm
Yeah.
not particularly interested in debating the semantics of what to call that, but it's not good.
Yeah, whatever it is, it's a gross violation of human rights. That was one of the things that really surprised me. Now, I wanted to get into your podcast, but just
Yeah,
before we did, I wanted to bring something up really quickly that you touched on.
yeah,
And
good.
that's the fact when you talked about like British colonial, like
Yeah,
hiring local people, that was actually the strategy of the British Empire. Like that's
yeah.
how they maintained their giant empire, like with only spending about 2% of their GDP on their actual military. Was they would hire and outfit natives to fight other natives. You can always pay one half of the poor to kill the other half. So just an interesting, horrifying part of world and British history.
Yeah. And again, like I'm quite certain that that native soldiers who are participating in the occupation of their country are like going to interact both with British people and with
Mhm.
natives in pretty much the same pattern that their white counterparts are
Yeah.
for all the same reasons and maybe some extra reasons too, right? Because
Yeah. It would usually be like they'd hire one ethnic group to kill the other or something like that. Yeah.
well, that's that. Yeah, a lot of the divide and conquer strategy. I mean, really, a lot of the a lot of the ethnic conflict hotspots of the world today are like kind of left over from the British Empire's use of that strategy. You know, India, Pakistan, Israel, and the Palestinians, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen it's a familiar pattern that plays out unfortunately throughout a lot of human history, and it's very brutal. And hopefully, we're on our way to moving beyond it. So, and on the note of moving beyond, let's talk a little bit about your podcast. This
Sure.
is exciting. I saw you had Dave Smith as one of your first guests.
Yeah. He was on episode 2. So just like this is very early days. The episode that came out on Monday was episode 3. And yeah, in episode, so like most of the people, who've been on are people who are, ideologically, on my page, right? Like people like Bhaskar Sankara, the editor of Jacobin and good friend of mine. But since I, didn't want to just have this be me talking to people I agree with, on episode 2, I had Dave Smith, who's a libertarian comedian and podcaster, is the host of something called Part of the Problem. It's a YouTube show podcast, and in like last year actually. One of the first debates I ever did was with Dave, and it's since then, because of how Part of the Problem manages content, right? It's been long enough now that it's paywalled, and thank God for it, right? Because it was definitely not my best performance, but I mean, this, like I said, that was one of the first times I'd really done that, and I think I approached it way too much like I was like, I don't know, like teaching a graduate seminar or something where you could like where you can kind of like bat around examples and kind of like try to lead people to a point without like quite spelling it out. And
And
of
that
course, in that kind of context, like that just reads as evasive, and it's like you really just have to get to the fucking point, right? Like
yeah.
and so, but I also went on last summer I went back at the show to debate Gina, who's a libertarian economist. He runs the Soho Forum debate series in New York, and I was a lot happier about how that went. but yeah, so I had Dave on, Give Them an Argument, episode 2, and we, we started out a little bit, talking about things that are more, areas of agreement, about, U.S. imperialism and things like that. That like many libertarians, he's actually good on stuff like that, and then and then got a little bit into all the stuff that we disagree about, which is like practically everything else.
Well, I haven't listened to that episode of your podcast, but I have. So for years, I have moderated Anarchists versus Libertarians, a Facebook group. So I've been arguing with these people for years, and it's what's amazing is that I found some of them are actually incredibly intelligent and have we've influenced each other over the years, and some of them it's like shouting at a brick wall. So I'm glad that I haven't seen Dave Smith's behavior in a debate, but
no, I mean, look, I mean, he's a libertarian, and he's not, I mean, he's a fairly right-wing libertarian. Like I have, I mean, he sees things in ways that are very alien to me, and obviously I think some of the premises are ridiculous, but like he's very, like he's very genial and very I don't know, like he comes off as very like earnest and he has a sense of humor. So I mean, if you're going to talk to a libertarian, you can do a lot worse.
Great. Well, that's good to hear. So what I also
should also add that there's another one of these coming up this next week, episode 4. There's the second half of that is going to be Yaron Brook from the Ayn Rand Institute, who I've never talked to before, but we're gonna get into to Rand's view that selfishness is a virtue.
Oh boy, that'll be interesting. I look forward to it. Now the name of the podcast is
Give Them an Argument.
Give Them an Argument, just like your book. And is it available on iTunes and?
Yep, all those places.
Terrific. I will be subscribing to it after this. I look forward to the episodes that you have coming up. There's one thing that I wanted to mention, by the way, because you get into this. So I'm a practitioner of Kyokushin karate, which is a full contact version of karate. And one of the things that I learned in tournament fights is that oftentimes if there's no clear winner in the fight, the judges tend to side with whoever threw more punches.
Yeah, right.
And I feel like a lot of the time the audience does that as well in debates, where debating is a little closer to performance art, and it's not necessarily about all of the arguments, but who is perceived to be on the attack and who is perceived to be on the defensive. I mean, would you agree with that as somebody who's
look, I think that is often how people react to those things in the moment, and that's something to keep in mind to an extent, right? That the presentation does matter, right? It's important. Like, certainly 95% of what I'm talking about in the book is getting the arguments right. But look, I mean, humans are a narrative species. It matters how you package them. Like that's also important, right? If you want people to listen to what you're saying. And obviously, when I feel like I have, thrown the most punches, obviously that feels better, right? For me coming out of it, right? No question about that. But I also think that we maybe want to separate out two things that very often, like, we kind of merge together. And one of them is people's perception of who, quote unquote, won a debate, right? Mm-hmm. And the other is persuasion, right? So, because if the ultimate point of the exercise, right, like, obviously, actual debates, right, as opposed to just like making arguments, responding to arguments, right, but like debates, like there's going to be a debate from 8 to 9 tonight, right? That kind of debate is obviously entertainment as much as it is anything, but to the extent that the point of it, right, like the thing that you care the most about is actually persuading people, then I think that's a very different thing from, like, people like coming away from it necessarily even thinking you won or not. And this is where I think actually, like, I think confusion about this exact thing is what leads a lot of people to say things like, oh, debate's pointless because like nobody ever changes their mind.
Right.
Because the true thing that they're latching onto when they say that is that it is extraordinarily rare for anybody to change their mind like in the room, right?
Yeah.
Like nobody, certainly the person you're debating, I mean, really, by the time you get to the point where you're doing a public debate, it's very like just psychological realism, right? You're gonna be pretty married to your position, and people, of course, do change their minds, but like when somebody is actually doing things like going out and having public debates on something that they think, if they change their mind about it, that's going to be like a years long process.
Yeah. I can attest to that also, because that literally happened with me and anarchism. Like I originally learned about anarchism because I found out there were anarchists. I was like, this can't be a thing. And I proceeded to argue for years with like this one anarchist who's now a Marxist economist. And I won the argument. I had to learn what anarchism was. I went in, I won the argument. And then like 6 months later, I was like, oh shit, he was right the whole time.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, right? Like, so even if you're not one of the people who's debating, even if you're just a bystander, most people's reaction to hearing a good argument for a position they don't like in the moment, realistically, is going to be irritation. Right? Like that's how most of us were. Like, I know I have, right? Like I think that's just how most of us react to that most of the time, right? At best, the reaction in the moment is going to be, oh, interesting. We have to think about that, right? Like that's like the gold medal as far as like what you could hope for in the moment. But like realistically, most of the time, like, hey, you're hearing somebody like stridently making arguments for a position you don't like in ways that you don't know how to answer, you're going to be irritated and frustrated. And if you can find a way to say they lost or whatever, you're going to do that, right? Like that's just human nature. But that doesn't mean that people don't change their minds. Like, it's just that we need to have a more realistic account of what it means really to change your mind because of debate, or because of, arguments that you heard someone make. I think the more realistic thing is like what you were just describing, like that, like I'll certainly, when I reflect back on times when I've changed my mind about things that I've argued with people about or heard other people argue about, the way it works isn't like, oh, it's some Paul on the road to Damascus thing where I just like, oh, damn it, you're right, right? It's more like, I still don't think so. And then like, maybe like 3 weeks later or something, like I'm thinking about something else and I'll kind of think back to it and be like, yeah, actually, that's a pretty good point, right?
Yeah.
Like, like
it takes time.
Yeah, it takes time, right? Oftentimes when people are persuaded by arguments, what that actually means is that when they hear the argument, it plants a seed that like takes some time to, kind of burrow into your head.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Right. And, or just like, you find yourself thinking back to the subject and you realize that you don't think what you used to think. And the very considerations that you used to dismiss now like are a big part of why you think the new thing. And that happens all the time. And like, if anything, it always kind of surprises me, like when people really take seriously this idea, oh, nobody changed their mind because of arguments. Like, really? Like, especially because frankly, sometimes I hear people say this who I actually know. And it's like, all right, dude, like I know a little bit about your life. Like you grew up in a conservative evangelical household. You became an atheist as a teenager because you were watching Richard Dawkins videos. You were just like a regular MSNBC liberal until 2016, and when you supported Bernie, and then you joined the DSA, and now you're like halfway to Maoism, and you're going to tell me that nobody changes their mind because of arguments?
That's really great. Okay, great. So we're a little over time, so I don't want to take up any more of yours tonight. I would love to have you back on the program sometime if you'd be up for it.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So Ben Burgis, where can people find you?
Let me just do the easiest thing and say benburgis.com. And you can find the Jack Bernard podcast.
Terrific. I really very much look forward to that podcast. And you guys, if anybody's looking for me, BrentonLengel.com, Google Brenton Lengel, and look for my comics, Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, which was just nominated for 2 Ringo Awards, which I'm like super excited about.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm up there with some creators like Dave Pepos and Neil Gaiman, which is really exciting. So anyway, so thank you guys very much. This has been Insurrection with Brenton Lengel and our interview with Ben Burgis, and we are signing off.